Slave girl's perfect pitch saves her master's life. Then she discovers the forged papers that could steal her brother. A young girl hums at dawn while dogs quiet their barking, her blue ribbon catching first light in a plantation kitchen. When the ferry rope snaps and the carriage slides toward jagged cypress, her whistle cuts through storm wind like a blade, and a life is saved before the whole town's eyes. But that same evening, an overseer appears with red-sealed papers claiming her little brother was sold months ago. The wax glows wrong in the lamplight. The name is spelled crooked, and hidden in the family Bible, faint pencil marks spell out a Latin word that could change everything. Patrollers wait at the courthouse. A bell tolls once through morning fog. The clerk holds 2 seals to the light, one real, one false. But when the truth comes out on those courthouse steps, will a widow choose her husband's promise over her plantation's survival? The plantation kitchen caught first light like a promise. Steam rose from the iron skillet, where biscuits browned. Coffee bubbled in a tin pot. 13-year-old Lila moved between the stove and the wide oak table, her blue ribbon catching the dawn glow through the window. She hummed low and steady, a church hymn that made the yard dogs quiet their barking. "Moses likes his chicory dark," she whispered to herself, pouring the bitter brew. Miss Charlotte takes hers with cream. Cook Dinah needs the soft bread for her teeth. Her voice was soft as butter, but her pitch was perfect. Every note fell exactly where it belonged. The dogs outside settled on their bellies, ears perked, but mouths closed. Lila wore a simple brown dress with sleeves rolled to her elbows. Around her neck hung a small locket on a blue ribbon. Inside the locket was a pressed flower from her mother, who had died when Lila was 7. The ribbon was the only bright thing she owned. She set the breakfast tray just as Charlotte Bellamy swept into the kitchen. Charlotte was young but looked older, with lines around her eyes and a tight mouth. Her black dress rustled with each step. She had been a widow for 6 months, and the grief sat heavy on her shoulders like a winter coat. "The coffee smells burnt," Charlotte said, though it did not. "Yes, miss." Lila kept her eyes down. Charlotte picked up the account book from the table. The pages were filled with numbers that made her stomach hurt. Bills for feed, for medicine, for the overseer's wages. Money going out, not much coming in. The river had flooded twice this spring, ruining half the cotton crop. "Pike says we need to settle some debts soon," Charlotte muttered, running her finger down the columns. "Before the creditors come calling." She snapped the book shut. "Take the tray to the dining room and tell Moses to hitch the carriage. I have business in town." "Yes, miss." Charlotte paused at the door. "That humming, it's too loud for morning." "Yes, miss." But Lila's humming had already done its work. The dogs stayed quiet as Charlotte walked across the yard. The mule in the stable stopped kicking his stall. Even the chickens settled down to peck at their corn without squawking. An hour later, Lila walked to the churchyard carrying a basket of herbs for the preacher's wife. The morning was warm, and the oak trees cast long shadows on the grass. She could hear voices near the church steps, Charlotte's voice and another woman's, both raised higher than was proper. "Your debts are common knowledge, Charlotte," said Mrs. Thornton, a thick woman with grey hair pinned tight. "Perhaps you should consider what properties you can spare." "I will not sell my people to pay bills," Charlotte replied, her voice sharp as a kitchen knife. "That is not how decent families manage." "Decent?" Mrs. Thornton laughed, and the sound carried across the churchyard like a crow's call. "You think yourself decent? Your husband spoiled those slaves rotten. Now look where it's gotten you." Lila stopped walking. She was close enough to see the parasol trembling in Charlotte's gloved hand, close enough to hear every word. "At least, I don't pretend they're family, Mrs. Thornton continued. "You let them sit in your kitchen, listen to your conversations. It's unseemly." Charlotte's face went red. She looked around and saw several townspeople gathering near the church door, drawn by the raised voices. Mr. Peterson stopped splitting wood. The preacher's wife put down her broom. "Even old Mr." Clay paused in his walk to listen. Charlotte lifted her chin. When she spoke, her voice carried clear across the yard. "Slaves are disgusting," she said. "I don't know what gave you the idea I coddle them." The words hit Lila like a slap. She set down her basket of herbs and pressed her hands to her sides. The blue ribbon at her throat felt suddenly tight. Mrs. Thornton smiled. "There, Now you sound sensible." The townspeople nodded and murmured their approval. Mr. Peterson went back to his wood. The preacher's wife picked up her broom. Charlotte had said what they expected to hear, what they wanted her to believe. But Lila did not move. She stood there holding her breath while Charlotte snapped her parasol shut and walked toward the carriage. The silk ribbon on the parasol whipped in the morning breeze. Lila watched the ribbon snap and flutter. She would remember that sound. She would remember every word Charlotte had spoken, every face that had smiled to hear them. The memory would sit in her mind like a song she could not forget, note by note, perfect and clear. She picked up her basket and finished her walk to the church. The preacher's wife took the herbs with a kind word, but Lila barely heard it. In her head, Charlotte's voice echoed, "Asterisk, slaves are disgusting. Asterisk." When she returned to the kitchen, Cook Dinah was stirring a pot of soup. "You look peaked, child. Sit and have some water." Lila sat at the small table by the window. She touched the locket at her throat and tried to hum, but no sound came. Outside, she could see Charlotte's carriage returning from town, wheels crunching on the gravel drive. The last thing Lila saw before noon was Charlotte's gloved hand tightening on the parasol, its silk ribbon snapping in the wind. By afternoon, the sky had turned the color of old pewter. Clouds piled up like cotton bales along the horizon, and the air grew thick with the promise of rain. Charlotte took the carriage to the river landing to meet with a cotton buyer from New Orleans. She wanted to settle at least one account before the week was out. Moses drove the carriage down the muddy road that led to the ferry. The wheels slipped and caught in the ruts left by other wagons. The river was running high from the spring floods, brown and choppy with small whitecaps that caught the grey light. "Weather's turning," Moses said, glancing up at the clouds. "We'll be quick about it," Charlotte replied, but her voice was tight with worry. The cotton buyer might not come at all if the storm hit first. At the landing, 2 other carriages waited for the ferry. The boat was on the far side, barely visible through the mist that rose from the water. Remy, the boatman, was loading bales of wool and would need time to cross. Charlotte stepped down from the carriage and walked to the edge of the wooden platform. The planks were slick with river spray, and the ferry rope creaked in the wind. She pulled her shawl closer and tried to calculate how much she might earn from the cotton still drying in the barns. Behind her, Lila climbed down from where she had been riding in the back of the carriage. Charlotte had brought her along to carry papers and mind the carriage horse while she conducted business. Lila stood quietly beside the wheel, her hand resting on the mule's neck. The storm came fast, the way river squalls always did. One moment the air was still, and the next it was full of driving rain and wind that bent the cypress trees nearly in half. The ferry rope groaned and suddenly snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Charlotte's carriage lurched forward on the wet planks. The mule reared and pulled to the right, toward the broken ferry pole that jutted from the water like a spear. Moses yanked on the reins, but the wooden platform was too slick. The wheels slid sideways, carrying the carriage toward the edge. "The pole!" Someone shouted. "She'll hit the pole!" Charlotte grabbed for the carriage rail, but her foot slipped on the wet planks. She fell hard, her black skirt tangling around her legs. The carriage kept sliding, and the broken ferry pole grew larger as it rushed toward her. Then Lila whistled. The sound cut through the storm like a blade. It was high and clear and perfectly pitched, a note that carried across the water better than any shout. Remy, on the far side of the river, heard it immediately and looked up from the bales he was loading. Lila whistled again, 3 short notes and 1 long one. It was the signal boatmen used when the ferry rope broke. Remy grabbed his long pole and pushed off from the far bank, steering straight toward the broken platform. But the carriage was still sliding. Moses had lost his grip on the reins, and the mule was wild with fear. Charlotte scrambled to her feet just as the wooden wheels reached the edge of the planks. Lila ran forward and grabbed the loose rope that had snapped from the ferry pole. Her hands moved quickly, the way they did when she braided bread or tied bundles of herbs. She had watched Moses knot ropes 100 times in the smokehouse, had memorized every twist and turn. She looped the rope around the carriage axle and pulled it tight. The carriage jerked to a stop just as the front wheel went over the edge. Charlotte fell against the back seat, breathing hard. Remy threw a line from his boat. Lila caught it and tied it to the platform post with the same quick knots she had learned from watching. The boat bumped against the planks just as the worst of the wind died down. Lord have mercy. Remy called out. "That whistle saved your life, miss. Never heard a signal that clear in a storm." Charlotte stood up slowly, her black dress muddy and torn. She looked at Lila, who was coiling the wet rope with careful hands. The girl's blue ribbon was soaked, but her face was calm. Charlotte started to speak, then stopped. Around the platform, other travelers had gathered to watch. Mr. Peterson from town, the traveling preacher, 2 patrollers who had been caught by the storm. They all saw her standing there, alive because of the slave girl she had called disgusting just that morning. "Thank you," Charlotte finally whispered, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. Lila nodded and stepped back. "Yes, miss." The rain softened to a drizzle. Moses calmed the mule and backed the carriage away from the edge. The cotton buyer never came, his boat had turned back when the storm hit. Charlotte climbed into the carriage with shaking hands. As they drove home, she watched the back of Lila's head, where the girl sat beside Moses. The blue ribbon was plastered to her neck, and her shoulders were straight despite the weight of her wet dress. The rope holds, rain beads on Charlotte's signet ring as the ferry bell tolls once in fog. The storm had passed by evening, but trouble rode in with the sunset. Overseer Pike arrived at the kitchen door just as Lila was washing the supper dishes. He was a tall man with thin arms and pale eyes that never seemed to blink. In his hand was a folded paper with a red wax seal. "Where's the boy?" he asked. Lila looked up from the dishwater. "Caleb's in the barn with Moses, sir." "Get him." Something in Pike's voice made Lila's hands still. She dried them on her apron and walked to the barn, where her little brother was helping Moses stack hay. Caleb was 7 years old, with the same dark eyes as Lila, and a laugh that could make the chickens cluck in harmony. "Pike wants you," she told him quietly. Caleb followed her back to the kitchen, where Pike waited with Charlotte and 2 men Lila had never seen before. They wore good coats and carried leather satchels like traveling lawyers. Pike unfolded the paper and smoothed it on the kitchen table. The red wax seal gleamed in the lamplight. "This here's a bill of sale," Pike said, "dated 6 months back. Mr. Bellamy sold the boy before he died to cover a debt in New Orleans. These gentlemen have come to collect." Charlotte leaned forward to read the paper. "That's impossible. My husband never sold anyone." "The debt was considerable," said one of the strangers, a thin man with a gold watch chain. "Your husband had business dealings in the city that you may not have known about. This sale was arranged privately to avoid embarrassing you." Lila looked at the paper over Charlotte's shoulder. Her reading was better than most people knew. The preacher's wife had taught her letters during the slow winter months. She could see her brother's name, written in careful script. Caleb, aged 7 years, sold for the sum of $600. But something was wrong with the paper. Lila had seen Pike's official documents before, when he bought supplies or hired extra hands. The parish seal was always brown wax, never red. And Charlotte's name was spelled wrong, Bellamy, instead of Bellamy. The thin man pulled out a pocket watch. "We'll take the boy tonight. Our boat leaves at dawn." "No," Charlotte said, but her voice was weak. "I need time to verify this. The debt is overdue, ma'am. We've been patient long enough." Pike leaned against the kitchen wall, his pale eyes fixed on Caleb. "Boy's got to go. Law's the law." Lila felt her brother's small hand slip into hers. His fingers were cold despite the warm evening. She squeezed gently and tried to think. The red wax bothered her. She had delivered papers to the courthouse with Charlotte several times, had watched the clerk use brown wax for all parish business. Red wax was cheaper, the kind traveling merchants used for ordinary letters. And the spelling. Charlotte's name was embroidered on handkerchiefs, carved on the garden gate, written in the family Bible, always with 2 L's. Bellamy, not Bellamy. "Where will you take him?" Charlotte asked. "That's not your concern," the thin man replied. "The boy belongs to our client now." Lila stepped forward. Her voice was soft but clear. "May I see the seal, miss?" Pike's eyes narrowed. "You don't speak unless spoken to." But Charlotte was already reaching for the paper. She held it up to the window, where the last light of evening made the red wax glow. "This seal is perfectly legal," the thin man finished. "Now, if you'll hand over the face, boy, we'll be on our way." "Tomorrow," Charlotte said suddenly. "I need until tomorrow to gather his things." The strangers exchanged glances. "Very well, but if the boy isn't ready by dawn, we'll involve the sheriff." They left with Pike, their boots loud on the wooden steps. Charlotte stood holding the paper, her hands shaking slightly. Lila lifted the paper to the window. Red wax glows wrong as the stormlight fades. "Miss Charlotte," Lila said quietly, "that seal isn't the right color." Charlotte turned to look at her. "What?" "Parish seals are brown wax, always brown." "And your name?" Lila pointed to the signature line. "It's spelled wrong." Charlotte stared at the paper. The red wax gleamed like a drop of blood in the fading light. If the document was forged, Pike had committed a serious crime. But if it was real, Caleb would be gone by morning. Either way, come dawn, everything would change. The midwife's cabin sat at the edge of the plantation, where the fields gave way to swamp, and the night sounds of frogs and insects filled the air. Lila had brought Caleb there after supper, telling Charlotte they needed herbs for his cough. It was not entirely a lie. The boy's chest had been tight since the storm. Aunt Millie was not really anyone's aunt, but she had delivered half the babies in the parish and tended the sick for more than 30 years. Her cabin was lined with jars of dried herbs and bottles of tonic. Bundles of mint and willow bark hung from the rafters, and the air smelled of pennyroyal and sage. "Sit yourself down, child," Millie told Caleb, patting a low stool near the fireplace. She was a small woman with silver hair braided neat and hands that moved quick and sure among her bottles. Steam rose from a pot where herbs were brewing. Millie added a pinch of wild cherry bark and stirred with a wooden spoon worn smooth by use. "Now then," she said to Lila, "what's really troubling you?" "This boy's cough ain't why you're here after dark." Lila told her about the paper with the red seal, about Pike and the men from New Orleans. Millie listened without speaking, occasionally adding herbs to her pot. "That Pike's got crooked dealings," Millie said finally. "Always has. But proving it's another matter." "The seal's the wrong color," Lila said. "And Miss Charlotte's name is misspelled." Millie nodded. "Smart girl. But you'll need more than that to stop him." She handed Caleb a cup of the steaming tea. "Drink this slow, boy. It'll ease your breathing." Caleb sipped the bitter tea and made a face. "It tastes like dirt." "Good dirt," Millie said with a smile. "The kind that helps things grow." Lila sat on a wooden chair by the window. Through the glass, she could see the lights of the main house across the fields. Charlotte was probably sitting in her parlor, studying that red seal by lamplight. "Mr. Bellamy was a good man," Millie said suddenly. "Not like some. He believed in keeping his word." "Yes, ma'am. He made promises, some written down, some just spoken. But he meant to keep them all." Millie reached into a wooden chest and pulled out a bundle wrapped in old cloth. "He told me once about things he stitched in places nobody would think to burn first." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal a small section of quilt binding, the kind that edged the heavy quilts used in winter. The binding was plain blue fabric, but tiny stitches formed letters along one edge. "Can you read these stitches?" Millie asked. Lila took the binding and held it close to the firelight. The stitches were so small they looked like decorative work, but she could make out words. Asterisk, 2 little ones kept as mine. Asterisk, what does it mean? Mr. Bellamy stitched that himself, late one night when his wife was heavy with child. He lost that baby, and the next one too. Never had children of his own. Millie poured herself a cup of tea. But he took to watching over other folks' children. 2 in particular. Lila's heart began to beat faster. Which 2? A girl who could sing hymns, perfect as Sunday bells, and her little brother who laughed like music. Millie looked directly at Lila. "He stitched promises for both of you, child." "Legal promises. Where?" "In the family Bible, I'd guess. He was always making little marks in the margins when he thought nobody was looking. Latin words from his schooling days." Lila remembered the Sunday services when Charlotte read from the big leather Bible. Sometimes she had noticed tiny marks in pencil along the edges of the pages, but she had thought they were just notes from sermons. "What kind of promises?" she asked. "The kind that set children free," Millie said quietly, "if the widow consents and the proper papers are filed." Steam from pennyroyal curls up past the rafters, while Lila mouths a Latin word she's seen in the Bible margin, manumissio. Caleb finished his tea and curled up on a blanket near the fire. His breathing was already easier, and his eyes were heavy with sleep. Lila covered him with an old quilt and kissed his forehead. "Millie," she whispered, "if there are promises in the Bible, how do we prove them? That's for the clerk to decide." "Mr. Whitcomb knows the law, and he's got the parish seal. Millie banked the fire for the night, but getting to him might be another matter. Pike's got friends among the patrollers. Lila thought about the routes she knew around the plantation. The main road was watched, but there were other ways. Paths through the swamp that the patrollers avoided, especially at night. There's a hymn the boatmen sing, she said slowly, about 3 turns and 1 bell. I always thought it was just a river song. Millie smiled. Sometimes songs are maps, child. Sometimes they're the only maps that matter. Outside, an owl called from the cypress trees. The sound meant midnight was coming, and with it, the last hours before dawn. In a few hours, Pike would return for Caleb. But Lila was beginning to see a path through the darkness. It would be dangerous, and it would require Charlotte to trust her completely. But it might be the only way to keep her brother home. She touched the blue ribbon at her throat and began to hum, very softly, the hymn about 3 turns and 1 bell. The family Bible sat on a shelf in Charlotte's parlor, thick as a man's fist and bound in black leather that had softened with age. Lila had seen it during Sunday readings, when Charlotte would open it on the small table by the window and read verses aloud in her clear voice. Now, in the hours before dawn, Lila knelt on the parlor floor with the Bible open before her. Charlotte held a candle close to the pages, while Lila searched the margins for the tiny markings she remembered. There, Lila whispered, pointing to a mark so faint it barely showed in the candlelight. In the book of Exodus. Charlotte leaned closer. The marking was in pencil, nearly worn away by time. A single Latin word, *manumitio*. What does that mean? Charlotte asked. Freedom, Lila said. The preacher taught it to me when we read about the Israelites leaving Egypt. It means to release from slavery. They found more markings scattered through the Bible. A date in the margin beside Psalm 23, a small cross near the story of the Good Samaritan, and on the very last page, hidden behind the back cover, a longer note in Mr. Pascanchi. Bellamy's careful hand, for the widow's choice and God's mercy 2 souls kept as mine own children shall be freed upon lawful filing with clerk's seal and witness. C.B. February 1853. Charlotte's hand trembled as she read the words. He wrote this just before he died. He meant to free us, Lila said. You and Caleb, but he needed you to agree. Why didn't he tell me? Lila thought about Mr. Bellamy, a quiet man who had spoken kindly to her but rarely directly. Maybe he was waiting for the right time. Maybe he thought he had more time. Charlotte closed the Bible and held it against her chest. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. In an hour, Pike would come for Caleb. Even if this is legal, Charlotte said, how do we prove it? Pike has his paper, and the men from New Orleans have already paid money. The clerk, Lila said. Mr. Whitcomb knows the difference between real seals and false ones, and he keeps all the parish records. Pike won't let us just walk to the courthouse, not with Caleb. Lila stood and moved to the window. The plantation was quiet in the pre-dawn darkness, but she could see a light in Pike's cabin across the yard. He was awake, probably getting ready for the morning's business. There's another way, she said. The hymn route. Charlotte frowned. What's that? A song the boatmen sing, about 3 turns and 1 bell. It tells how to reach the courthouse without using the main road. Lila touched the blue ribbon at her throat. Moses taught it to me when I was small. He used to work on the river before he came here. You want to take Caleb through the swamp? At night? The patrollers don't go into the swamp. Too many snakes, and the ground soft. But if you know the way, you can reach the courthouse by dawn. Charlotte set down the candle and walked to her desk. Inside the top drawer was a ring with the Bellamy family seal, a design of crossed wheat sheaves that had been carved decades ago. The ring was gold, heavy in her hand. If we do this, she said slowly, and the clerk says your husband's note is legal, then you'd have to sign the papers. Make it official. Lila's voice was steady, but her heart was pounding. You'd have to choose to let us go. Charlotte slipped the ring onto her finger. The seal faced inward, toward her palm, the way it should for making an impression in wax. And if the clerk says it's not legal, if Pike's paper is real, then Caleb goes with those men, and you've lost nothing but a night's sleep. A rooster crowed in the distance. Dawn was coming fast. Charlotte made her decision. Get your brother, and tell Moses to harness the small wagon, quiet as he can. We'll need supplies for the swamp route. Lila ran to the midwife's cabin, where Caleb was sleeping safe under Millie's care. She shook him gently awake. Time to go, little brother. Where? Somewhere safe, but you have to be very quiet. Millie was already up, packing herbs and tonic in a small bag. Take this, she said, handing Lila a vial of willow bark tea. For the boy's cough, if it comes back. Thank you, and take this too. Millie pressed the piece of quilt binding into Lila's hand. You'll need all the proof you can carry. Moses had the wagon ready behind the barn, away from Pike's view. The mule was hitched and waiting, her breath visible in the cool morning air. Charlotte climbed up with the Bible and her ring. Lila lifted Caleb onto the seat between them. You sure about this route? Moses asked quietly. 3 turns and 1 bell, Lila said. Just like the song. Moses nodded and handed her the reins. That mule knows the way better than any of us. Let her lead when you're not sure. They drove away from the plantation as the first hint of pink touched the eastern sky. Behind them, Pike's cabin was still lit, but they were already lost in the shadows of the cypress trees. The hymn route led through parts of the county that most people never saw. Narrow tracks that wound between moss-draped trees, past ponds where alligators floated like logs and herons stood motionless in the shallows. Lila hummed as she drove, the tune that Moses had taught her years ago. The mule's ears pricked forward at the familiar melody, and her steps became sure and quick. Asterisk, 3 turns to the rising sun. Asterisk, asterisk, 1 bell when the day is done. Asterisk, asterisk. Follow the track that the river made. Asterisk, asterisk, where the cypress gives the shade. Asterisk. The first turn came at a lightning-struck oak that split the path in 2. Lila guided the mule to the right, toward the sound of running water. The second turn was at a fallen log that bridged a creek. They splashed through water that came up to the wagon wheels. Caleb coughed once, a small sound in the morning quiet. Charlotte handed him the vial from Millie, and he sipped the bitter tea without complaint. How much further? Charlotte asked. The third turn should be just ahead, Lila said, where the bell tower comes into view. They topped a small rise, and there was the town spread out below them. The courthouse sat in the center square, its white columns bright in the early sun. The bell tower rose above it all, and as they watched, the bell swung once to mark the hour. Asterisk, 1 bell when the day is done. Asterisk, there, Lila said. That's our signal. They drove down into the town as the streets began to fill with morning traffic. Wagons loaded with cotton and timber, women carrying baskets to market, children running errands before school. No one paid attention to one more small wagon with a woman and 2 children. The courthouse was a grand building with wide steps and tall windows. Mr. Whitcomb's office was on the first floor, behind a door marked Parish Clerk in gold letters. But as they approached, Lila saw something that made her stomach drop. Pike's horse was tied to the hitching post in front of the building, and through the window she could see Pike himself talking to someone inside, probably Mr. Whitcomb. He's here, Lila whispered. Pike's already here. Charlotte's face went pale. He must have guessed what we were doing. They sat in the wagon, watching Pike gesture through the window. In his hand was the red-sealed paper that claimed Caleb as sold property. What do we do now? Charlotte asked. Lila looked around the town square. People were going about their morning business, unaware of the drama playing out at the courthouse. A group of children walked past on their way to school, laughing and swinging their books by leather straps. We wait, she said, and when Pike leaves, we go in. What if he doesn't leave? What if he's just waiting for us? Then we trust in the hymn, Lila said. It brought us this far. She began to hum again, very softly. The tune drifted across the square, and Lila noticed something strange. The horses tied at the various hitching posts grew calm, their ears forward and their heads low. Even the dogs that wandered the streets seemed to settle down. One of the courthouse windows was open, and the hymn carried inside. Through the glass, Lila could see Pike pause in his conversation and look around as if trying to identify the sound. Then Mr. Whitcomb appeared in the window. He was an elderly man with white hair and spectacles that reflected the morning light. He spotted the wagon immediately and raised one hand in a small wave. Pike turned to see what the clerk was looking at. When he saw Charlotte and the children in the wagon, his face went dark as a storm cloud. The mule stamps once and swishes her tail. Courthouse windows catch the slant morning light. "He's seen us," Charlotte said. "Yes," Lila agreed, "but Mr. Whitcomb has seen us too." Pike came out of the courthouse and walked toward their wagon. But before he could reach them, Mr. Whitcomb appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Bellamy," the clerk called out. "How fortunate. I was just discussing some irregularities in a document that concerns your property. Perhaps you could settle a few questions." Pike stopped walking, his pale eyes fixed on Leela and Caleb, but he could not object to the clerk's invitation without seeming suspicious. Charlotte climbed down from the wagon with the Bible in her hands. "Of course, Mr. Whitcomb. I'd be happy to help." Lila lifted Caleb down and followed Charlotte toward the courthouse steps. As they passed Pike, he leaned close and spoke in a low voice. "This won't change anything. That boy belongs to my buyers now." But his voice was not as steady as his words. And when Lila looked at him, she saw something new in his pale eyes. He was afraid. Mr. Whitcomb's office smelled of leather and old paper. Tall shelves lined the walls, filled with ledger books and rolled documents tied with ribbon. The clerk's desk was neat and organized, with separate containers for different colors of sealing wax. Pike sat in a chair by the window, the red sealed document on his lap. Charlotte sat across from him with Caleb beside her and Lila standing at her shoulder. The family Bible rested on the desk between them. "Now then," Mr. Whitcomb said, settling behind his desk. "Mr. Pike has brought me a bill of sale that raises some questions. Perhaps you can help clarify things, Mrs. Bellamy." He put on his spectacles and examined Pike's paper. The red wax seal gleamed under the lamplight. "First question. Do you recall your husband conducting any business in New Orleans that might have resulted in this sale?" "No," Charlotte said firmly. "My husband never sold anyone. He was opposed to breaking up families." Pike leaned forward. "With respect, ma'am, you might not have known all your husband's business dealings. Men sometimes handle debts privately to protect their wives from worry." Mr. Whitcomb nodded thoughtfully. "That's possible, certainly, but there are other concerns." He pointed to the red seal. "This wax, for instance. We don't use red wax for bills of sale in this parish. Always brown." "The document was prepared in New Orleans," Pike said quickly. "Different parishes use different colors." Mr. Whitcomb opened a drawer and pulled out several other documents. "These are bills of sale from Orleans Parish, filed here for our records. All brown wax, you see." Pike's face was getting red. "Maybe they changed their procedures recently. And then there's the spelling." The clerk pointed to Charlotte's name on the document. "Bellamy is spelled with 2 L's. This document has only one." "Clerical error," Pike said. "Happens all the time." Mr. Whitcomb removed his spectacles and cleaned them carefully. "Mr. Pike, I've been parish clerk for 27 years. In my experience, when a document has one irregularity, it might be an honest mistake. When it has several." He put his spectacles back on. "Well, it bears closer examination." Charlotte opened the family Bible and showed the clerk the markings they had found. Mr. Whitcomb read the Latin words with interest. "Manumissio," he said, "and this date February 1853, just before Mr. Bellamy's death." He looked at the longer note hidden behind the back cover. "This appears to be a legal intention, properly witnessed by the date and signature." "That's just scribblings," Pike said, standing up. "Nothing official about it." "On the contrary," Mr. Whitcomb opened one of his ledger books. "I have a record here of Mr. Bellamy asking about manumission procedures last winter. He wanted to know what forms were required and how they should be filed." Lila pulled the piece of quilt binding from her pocket and placed it on the desk. He stitched promises too, in places nobody would think to burn first. The clerk examined the tiny stitches that spelled out times 2 little ones kept as mine asterisk. Remarkable workmanship, and consistent with the Bible notation. Pike's face was now bright red. "This is all nonsense. I have a legal document with a legal seal. These are just family keepsakes. Let's test that, shall we?" Mr. Whitcomb reached for a block of brown wax and held it over a candle flame. "Mrs. Bellamy, may I borrow your signet ring?" Charlotte removed the heavy gold ring and handed it to the clerk. He pressed it into the soft brown wax, then held the impression up to the light. "You see this fine line here?" he said, pointing to a hairline crack in the wax. "That's from a tiny flaw in your family seal. It appears on all authentic impressions." He compared the brown impression to Pike's red seal. "This red seal has no such line. It's a copy, and not a very good one." The office was very quiet. Outside, Lila could hear the normal sounds of town life, horses and wagons, people calling to each other, children playing in the square. But inside, the air felt heavy as storm clouds. Pike stood up slowly. "Even if that paper's irregular, the boy still belongs to my buyers. They paid good money. Money paid for stolen property does not make the theft legal, Mr. Whitcomb said calmly. "And forgery is a serious crime, Mr. Pike, one that carries significant penalties." Pike's pale eyes darted toward the door. Lila could see him thinking about running, about abandoning the whole scheme and disappearing into the swamp. But, before he could move, Charlotte spoke up. "Mr. Whitcomb," she said quietly, "if my husband's intention is legal, what do I need to do to honor it?" The clerk pulled out a blank form and dipped his pen in ink. "You need to sign a formal manumission, stating your consent to free the children named in your husband's note. I'll witness it with the proper seal and file it in the parish records." Charlotte took the pen in her hand. The gold nib caught the morning light as it hovered over the paper. "Before you sign," Pike said desperately, "remember your debts. You need every hand you can get to work the plantation. Free workers cost wages. Some things are more valuable than money," Charlotte said. She signed her name with firm, clear strokes. "Mr." Whitcomb pressed the parish seal into brown wax beside her signature. The impression was perfect, complete with the hairline that proved its authenticity. "Lila and Caleb," the clerk read aloud, "are hereby manumitted and granted all rights and freedoms of citizenship, according to the laws of Louisiana and the intention of the late Charles Bellamy." He sanded the wet ink and folded the papers. "Congratulations. You're free." Brown wax cools to amber. The pen nib gleams as it lifts from parchment. Somewhere a church bell marks the hour with one clear note. Lila felt Caleb's small hand slip into hers. Free. The word sat strange in her mind, like a song she had never heard before but somehow knew by heart. Pike was already at the door. "This isn't over," he said, but his voice was weak. "Actually, Mr." Whitcomb said, "I believe it is. Sheriff Morrison will want to discuss that forged document with you, Mr. Pike. I suggest you make yourself available." Pike left without another word. Through the window, Lila watched him mount his horse and ride hard toward the edge of town. He did not look back. "Now then," the clerk said to Charlotte, "you'll need copies of these papers, and if you're planning to employ these children as free workers, we should draft a proper contract." "Yes," Charlotte said. "I'd like to hire Lila as a teacher, for the river children who need schooling. An excellent idea. Education is always a worthy investment." Outside, the town was fully awake now. But for Lila, everything felt different. The same streets, the same buildings, but she was walking through them as herself for the first time. Not as someone's property, but as a person with her own name and her own choices. She touched the blue ribbon at her throat and smiled. Some things, once given freely, could never be taken back. Word travels fast in a small town, especially word about unusual happenings at the courthouse. By mid-morning, half the county knew that Charlotte Bellamy had freed 2 slave children and that Overseer Pike had been accused of forgery. Some said Charlotte had lost her mind with grief. Others whispered that she had debt so heavy she was selling off her people and calling it charity. A few remembered Mr. Bellamy's gentle nature and thought perhaps his widow was simply honoring his wishes. But nobody knew the whole truth yet. That would come later, when the sheriff gathered evidence and the judge made his ruling. For now, there were just questions and rumors floating through the town like morning mist. Charlotte drove the wagon back to the plantation with Lila and Caleb beside her. The papers from the courthouse were folded safely in her reticule, but she knew that signing them had been only the first step. Pike still had allies among the creditors and the neighboring plantation owners. He would not give up easily. "What happens now?" Lila asked as they turned into the plantation drive. "Now we find out who our friends are," Charlotte said. The first test came before they reached the house. 3 riders waited in the front yard, Mr. Thornton from the neighboring plantation, Deputy Hayes from town, and a stranger in a black suit who carried a leather portfolio. Charlotte handed the reins to Leila and climbed down from the wagon. "Gentlemen, to what do I owe this visit? We hear you've been making unauthorized transactions, Mr. Thornton said. He was a large man with a red face and hands that looked more comfortable holding a whip than a teacup. "Freeing valuable property without consulting your creditors." The man in the black suit opened his portfolio. "Mrs. Bellamy, I represent the New Orleans Commercial Bank. Your late husband's estate owes considerable sums, and this bank holds liens on all plantation property, including the slaves. The children are no longer slaves," Charlotte said calmly. "They are free citizens with proper papers." "Papers can be challenged," Deputy Hayes said. He was a thin young man who seemed nervous about the whole situation, especially when there are questions about the deceased's mental state when he wrote his intentions. Leila climbed down from the wagon and stood beside Charlotte. She still wore her simple brown dress, but something about her posture had changed. She stood straighter, her chin raised slightly. The blue ribbon at her throat caught the sunlight like a small flag. "My husband was of sound mind until the day he died," Charlotte said, "and the parish clerk has verified the legality of his manumission clause." "Whitcomb's an old fool, Mr. Thornton said. "This matter needs to go before a proper judge." "I agree," said the man from the bank, "and until it's resolved, these children should be held as disputed property." Caleb moved closer to Leila, his eyes wide. She put her hand on his shoulder and hummed very softly just a few notes of the hymn that had guided them through the swamp. Even the horses seemed to calm at the sound. "You have no right to take them," Charlotte said. "I have legal documents. You have questionable papers based on margin scribblings," Mr. Thornton interrupted. "Any judge with sense will see through this charade." The deputy stepped forward. "Mrs. Bellamy, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to surrender the children until this matter can be properly adjudicated." Charlotte's face went pale, but she did not move. "And if I refuse, then I'll have to place you under arrest for theft of property and conspiracy to defraud creditors." The yard was very quiet, except for the sound of Leila's humming. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. The three men waited for Charlotte's answer. Then, from the direction of the road, came the sound of wagon wheels and horses' hooves. Another group of riders was approaching, but these looked different from the hard-faced creditors. Mr. and Mrs. Ward, the Quaker couple who ran the grain mill, drove their wagon into the yard. Behind them rode Dr. Matthews, the town physician, and Reverend Williams from the Methodist Church. Even old Mr. Clay had come, though he usually avoided any kind of confrontation. "Mrs. Bellamy," Mr. Ward called out as he climbed down from his wagon. "We heard there was some difficulty here." "Nothing that concerns you, Ward," Mr. Thornton said. "This is a private matter. When children are involved, it concerns us all," Mrs. Ward replied quietly. She was a small woman with grey hair and a voice soft as cotton, but there was steel in her eyes. "Doctor." Matthews dismounted and walked over to examine Caleb. "This boy's been coughing. Have you been giving him proper medicine?" "Willow bark tea," Leila said. "From the midwife. Good choice. The cough is clearing up nicely." He straightened and looked at the deputy. "These children are in excellent health. No signs of mistreatment or neglect." "That's not the issue," the banker protested. "The issue is legal ownership and outstanding debts." Reverend Williams opened his Bible. "The issue, gentlemen, is what's right in the eyes of God, and separating children from their families is never right, regardless of the law. Since when do Methodists quote scripture to defend property theft?" "Mr. Thornton demanded. "Since today," the Reverend replied mildly. Deputy Hayes looked uncomfortable. He was outnumbered now, and some of these people voted in elections. "Perhaps we should wait for the sheriff before taking any action." "The sheriff is in the county seat today," the banker said, "and these children need to be secured before they disappear into the swamp." Leila stopped humming. In the sudden silence, she spoke clearly. "We're not going anywhere. This is our home." "You don't have a home," Mr. Thornton snapped. "You have owners, and your current owner is in debt to her eyeballs." "I have no owners," Leila said. "Not anymore." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded papers from the courthouse. "These say I'm free, and free means I choose where I go and what I do." The banker grabbed for the papers, but Mrs. Ward stepped between them. "Touch that child and answer to me," she said in her soft, steel voice. "Mr." Thornton's face was getting red again. "This is ridiculous. Ward, these are slaves. They don't get to choose anything." "We're slaves, Doctor," Matthews corrected. "The documents appear to be in order. Documents can be forged." "Indeed they can," said a new voice from the road, "which is why I always examine them very carefully." Everyone turned to see Mr. Whitcomb driving his buggy into the yard. The parish clerk looked older and more frail than usual, but his voice was clear and strong. "Mr. Whitcomb," the deputy said with relief, "thank goodness. Perhaps you can settle this matter." The clerk climbed down from his buggy and walked to where Lila stood, holding the papers. "May I see those documents, my dear?" She handed them over. He examined them carefully, holding them up to the light to check the wax seals. "These are genuine parish documents," he announced. "Properly signed, sealed, and witnessed. Lila and Caleb are free citizens of Louisiana. And the debt?" the banker demanded. "What about the outstanding liens on plantation property?" "Liens on property do not extend to human beings who have been legally manumitted," Mr. Whitcomb said patiently. "That was established in Groves versus Commercial Trust, 1847. The banker's face fell. "But the plantation cannot operate without adequate labor. How will Mrs. Bellamy pay her debts?" "That's Mrs. Bellamy's concern, not yours. The bank may foreclose on land and buildings, but not on people. Mr. Thornton pointed at Lila and Caleb. "Those two represent $600 each, minimum, money that could settle debts and keep creditors satisfied. Those two, Mrs. Ward said firmly, are children, not commodities." The deputy looked around at all the faces, creditors, neighbors, church folk, all watching to see what he would do. "Mr. Whitcomb, in your professional opinion, are these manumission papers legally binding?" "Absolutely. Mr. Bellamy followed proper procedures, and his widow has given lawful consent. The matter is settled." "Then I see no grounds for arrest," the deputy said, much to Mr. Thornton's disgust. The banker closed his portfolio with a snap. "This is not over. We'll appeal to the circuit court. We'll challenge the deceased's mental competency. You'll waste everyone's time and money." "Mr. Whitcomb said calmly, "I've been clerk for this parish for nearly 3 decades. I know a legal document when I see one." One by one, the creditors climbed back onto their horses. "Mr. Thornton glared at Charlotte before riding away. "You'll regret this decision, Mrs. Bellamy. Mark my words." The banker and deputy followed, leaving dust clouds hanging in the morning air. When they were gone, the neighbors gathered around Charlotte and the children. Mrs. Ward put her arm around Lila's shoulders. "Are you all right, dear?" "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for coming. We came as soon as we heard," Dr. Matthews said. "Word is all over town about Pike's forgery and your husband's hidden papers." Reverend Williams shook Charlotte's hand. "You did the right thing. Your husband would be proud." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, the first tears Lila had seen her shed since the day began. "I hope so. I truly hope so." Mr. Ward looked toward the road where the creditors had disappeared. "They'll be back. Maybe not today, but soon. You'll need friends when they come." "I know," Charlotte said, "and I'm grateful for yours." The neighbors began to disperse, but not before each one stopped to speak with Lila and Caleb. Mrs. Ward invited them to visit the mill any time. Dr. Matthews said Caleb should come see him if his cough returned. Even old Mr. Clay patted Lila's head and told her she was a brave girl. As the last wagon disappeared down the road, Charlotte, Lila, and Caleb stood alone in the yard. The house looked the same, the fields stretched out green and peaceful, but everything had changed. "What happens tomorrow?" Lila asked. "Tomorrow we start figuring out how to run a plantation with free workers instead of slaves," Charlotte said, "and how to pay debts without selling people. Will it work?" Charlotte looked at the papers in her hand, legal proof that she had given up $1,200 worth of human property to honor her dead husband's promise. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but we'll find out together." The sun was high now, and there was work to be done. Cotton needed picking, meals needed cooking, animals needed tending. The same work as always, but done by choice instead of force. Lila touched the blue ribbon at her throat and felt something she had never experienced before. Not just freedom from slavery, but freedom to choose her own path. It was frightening and wonderful at the same time. Papers rustling in the warm breeze, a ribbon catching light like a small flame, the distant sound of church bells marking the end of one time and the beginning of another. By evening, the whole county knew the story, how Charlotte Bellamy had found hidden papers in her husband's Bible, how she had faced down creditors and Pike's forgery to honor a dead man's promise, how a slave girl's perfect pitch and keen memory had saved both their lives and exposed a fraud. Some people called Charlotte a saint, others called her a fool, but everyone agreed that what had happened at the courthouse that morning was something they would remember for the rest of their lives. As the sun set over the plantation, Charlotte sat on her porch with the family Bible in her lap. Lila was in the kitchen preparing supper, the same work she had always done, but now as a paid employee rather than property. Caleb played in the yard, his laughter floating across the evening air. The future was uncertain. The creditors would return, with lawyers and court papers. The neighbors would whisper and judge. The plantation would have to adapt to a new way of doing business. But tonight, for the first time in months, Charlotte felt at peace. She had kept her husband's promise. She had chosen mercy over profit. And somehow, that felt like victory. Inside the house, Lila began to hum as she worked. The melody drifted out through the open windows, a hymn about freedom and redemption, sung in perfect pitch by a girl who was finally free to choose her own songs. The music settled over the plantation like a blessing, and even the dogs lay down to listen. 3 weeks after the courthouse confrontation, Charlotte stood on her front porch watching the sun rise over fields that looked the same but felt entirely different. The cotton was coming in well despite the upheaval, and the workers, now paid employees rather than slaves, had proven more industrious than she had expected. Moses still managed the stable and the field work, but now he drew a weekly wage and lived in the cabin he had always occupied by choice rather than assignment. Cook Dinah had stayed on as well, delighted to finally receive payment for skills everyone had depended on for years. Even some of the field hands had chosen to remain, preferring familiar work under better conditions to the uncertainty of seeking employment elsewhere. But the biggest change was Lila. Each morning she could be found in the old smokehouse, which had been cleared out and fitted with benches and a blackboard. Children arrived just after breakfast, some from the plantation, others from neighboring farms, a few whose parents brought them by river ferry from across the water. "Today we'll practice letters," Lila would say, her blue ribbon bright against her new white dress, "and afterward we'll sing the hymn that teaches numbers." The children, ranging in age from 5 to 14, sat in neat rows and repeated their lessons with the same attention they had once given to avoiding overseers' notice. But their faces were different, now alert with possibility instead of dulled by fear. Charlotte often stood outside the schoolhouse door, listening to Lila teach. The girl's voice was as clear and perfect as ever, but now it carried authority along with melody. When she sang mathematical concepts, addition tables set to familiar tunes, Bible verses that reinforced spelling patterns, even the most restless child would sit still and absorb. "She's a natural teacher," Dr. Matthews had observed during one of his visits. Clear explanations, patient repetition, and that remarkable voice to hold attention. "You've made a wise investment, Mrs. Bellamy." Investment. The word still felt strange when applied to Lila. For 13 years, Charlotte had thought of the girl as property valuable, well-trained property, but property nonetheless. Now she was something unprecedented, a free employee whose skills and judgment Charlotte relied on daily. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Several neighbors had stopped visiting, uncomfortable with the idea of taking tea in a house where former slaves now sat at the table as equals. The Methodist Ladies' Auxiliary had tactfully suggested that Charlotte might be happier worshipping elsewhere. Even some of the remaining workers struggled to adjust to receiving wages and having choices, but there had been unexpected support as well. The Quaker families, never numerous but quietly influential, had increased their trade with the plantation. Dr. Matthews brought his own children to Lila's school. Reverend Williams had publicly endorsed Charlotte's decision during a Sunday sermon that was still being discussed weeks later. Most surprising of all was the attention from beyond the county. A newspaper reporter from Baton Rouge had come to interview Charlotte about her experiment in free labor. A delegation of Methodist ministers had visited to observe Lila's teaching methods. Even a professor from Louisiana College had written requesting copies of the hymns Lila used to teach reading and arithmetic. "You're becoming famous," Moses told Charlotte with a grin as she read the latest letter from an educational society in New Orleans. "Folks are calling you the manumission lady." "I'm not sure that's entirely a compliment." "Maybe not, but it's attention. And attention brings opportunity." He was right. The same week that 3 plantation owners cancelled their seed orders, 2 cotton buyers from Natchez had arrived with better prices than Charlotte had seen in years. They were curious about the free labor experiment and wanted to test whether cotton picked by paid workers was superior to that harvested by slaves. "Motivation," one of them explained to Charlotte as they examined bales in the warehouse. "A worker who benefits from quality has incentive to maintain it. A slave who benefits nothing has incentive to do the minimum." The early results were promising. The cotton was cleaner, with fewer broken bowls and less debris. The workers took pride in their output because their wages depended on it. Even children who had once moved through the fields like sleepwalkers now worked with energy and purpose. But the most dramatic change was visible every evening when work ended. Instead of the silent, exhausted trudge to slave quarters that Charlotte remembered from her childhood, the plantation now bustled with conversation and laughter. Workers discussed plans for spending their wages, debated techniques for improving crop yields, and gathered around Lila when she practiced new teaching songs. "It's like watching dead trees sprout leaves," Millie observed during one of her evening visits. The midwife had become Charlotte's closest advisor, helping navigate the practical challenges of transforming a slave plantation into something unprecedented. "Some days I wonder if I've made a terrible mistake," Charlotte admitted as they sat on the porch watching Caleb play with other children in the yard. "The debts are still substantial, and I'm not sure this new system can generate enough profit to keep us solvent." "Profit isn't just money," Millie replied. "Look at that boy." Caleb was leading a group of children in a singing game, his voice clear and confident. 3 weeks ago he had been a piece of disputed property, terrified and voiceless. Now he was simply a 7-year-old boy, learning to read and teaching younger children the songs his sister had taught him. "He'll never know the fear you grew up with," Millie continued. "None of these children will. That has to be worth something. Pike would say I'm sentimental. That business is business, and feelings have no place in economic calculations." "Pike," Millie said with contempt, "is sitting in the parish jail, awaiting trial for forgery and fraud. His opinions on business might be somewhat compromised." The legal proceedings against Pike had moved faster than anyone expected. Mr. Whitcomb's careful documentation of the forged papers, combined with testimony from the attempted buyers, had convinced the circuit judge to hold Pike without bail. Additional charges were pending as investigators examined his plantation records and discovered years of fraudulent transactions. They found evidence he'd been skimming from 5 different plantations, Dr. Matthews had reported during his last visit. Fake receipts, altered account books, forged transfer papers. "Your husband's death just gave him opportunity to attempt something more ambitious." Charlotte shuddered to think how close Pike had come to succeeding. Without Lila's sharp eyes and perfect memory, Caleb would be gone and the plantation would be bankrupt. The girl's attention to detail, wrong wax color, misspelled name, crooked seal, had unraveled a scheme years in the making. Now, as evening settled over the transformed plantation, Charlotte watched Lila emerge from the schoolhouse, carrying the day's lessons. Her white dress was smudged with chalk dust, and her blue ribbon had come slightly loose from the day's activities, but her face glowed with satisfaction. "How did the lessons go?" Charlotte asked as Lila climbed the porch steps. "Very well. Jenny Miller finally mastered her multiplication tables, and little Thomas can write his full name without help." Lila settled into the chair beside Charlotte's. "Tomorrow I want to start them on geography. Moses has drawn wonderful maps of the parish that show all the river routes. And your brother? Caleb's reading improves daily. He has an excellent memory for stories, and he helps the younger children with their letters." Lila smiled. "He wants to learn navigation so he can help Remy with the ferry." A worthy ambition. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink toward the cypress trees. From the kitchen came the timeless sounds of Dinah preparing supper, the clatter of plates, the sizzle of cornbread in the skillet, the low murmur of Moses discussing tomorrow's work with the other hands. "Charlotte," Lila said quietly, using her employer's first name for the first time since gaining her freedom. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you regret it? Freeing us, I mean. The financial difficulties, the criticism from neighbors, all the uncertainty." Charlotte considered the question seriously. The debts were real, the social isolation was painful, and the future remained uncertain. Some nights she lay awake, calculating expenses and wondering if the plantation could survive another year of reduced profits. But then she remembered the morning at the courthouse when she had signed the manumission papers, the weight that had lifted from her chest when she honored her husband's promise. The look in Lila's eyes when she realized she was truly free. "No," Charlotte said finally. "I don't regret it. Whatever happens, I know I did the right thing. Even if the plantation fails, especially then. Money can be earned again. Debts can be paid eventually. But some choices change who you are forever." A church bell tolled the hour from across the field, 7 o'clock, time for evening prayers and preparation for tomorrow's work. But tonight the sound carried a different meaning, not just the marking of time, but the celebration of time freely chosen. Lila stood and smoothed her white dress. "I should help Dinah with supper, and I want to review tomorrow's lessons." "Lila," the girl paused at the door. "Thank you for saving my life at the ferry, for exposing Pike's fraud, for staying here and helping build something new. Thank you for letting me choose." After Lila went inside, Charlotte remained on the porch as darkness gathered around the plantation. Oil lamps flickered to life in the workers' cabins, and she could hear fragments of conversation and laughter carrying across the night air. In the distance, a steamboat whistle echoed from the river. Somewhere children were practicing the songs Lila had taught them. A mule huffed softly in the stable, and crickets began their evening chorus in the cotton fields. It was the same plantation Charlotte had known all her life, worked by the same hands and producing the same crops. But everything was different now. The fear that had hung over the quarters like fog was gone. The silence that had marked evening routines was replaced by human voices making human choices. She thought of her husband Charles, dead these 6 months, but somehow more present now than he had been in years. His hidden notes and secret intentions had finally borne fruit. His promise to 2 children had been kept. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. More creditors would come, more debts would come due, more neighbors would express their disapproval. But tonight, Charlotte felt the deep satisfaction of promises kept and courage rewarded. Inside the house, she could hear Lila beginning the evening prayer, not the mumbled recitation that slaves had been forced to perform, but a genuine conversation with a God who had finally answered years of patient petitions. The prayer ended with a hymn, voices joining in harmony. Adult voices and children's voices, old hands and new students, all singing together the songs that had once been codes for survival and were now simply celebrations of faith. Charlotte closed her eyes and listened. The music drifted out over fields where free workers slept in chosen beds, over a river that carried news of unprecedented changes, over a county that was slowly learning new ways to live with justice. When the hymn ended, the plantation settled into the quiet rhythms of evening. But it was a different quiet now, not the exhausted silence of the oppressed, but the peaceful rest of people who had worked by choice and would wake tomorrow to choose again. A light breeze stirred the curtains and carried the scent of cotton blossoms across the porch. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called to its mate and was answered. Charlotte rose and went inside to join her household for supper, a household that had learned, finally, the difference between owning and belonging. 6 months later, on a crisp November morning that smelled of wood smoke and river fog, Charlotte stood on the courthouse steps holding a leather portfolio. Beside her, Lila wore a dark blue dress with her ribbon bright at the throat. Caleb stood between them in his Sunday clothes, clutching a small slate on which he had carefully copied his name in his best handwriting. The entire town had gathered to witness what the newspapers were calling the Great Accounting, the public presentation of financial records that would determine whether Charlotte's experiment in free labor had succeeded or failed. Judge Morrison sat behind a table that had been brought outside for the occasion. Mr. Whitcomb waited with his official ledgers and seal. Even Pike was present, brought from jail under guard to face additional charges related to his fraudulent accounting. Mrs. Bellamy, the judge said formally, you have requested this public hearing to present evidence regarding the financial viability of free labor on a working plantation. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. And you understand that these proceedings will determine whether your creditors may legally force the sale of property to satisfy outstanding debts. I do. Charlotte opened her portfolio and removed a thick sheaf of documents. 6 months ago, this plantation operated at a loss of approximately $2,000 annually. Crop yields were poor, worker productivity was minimal, and operating expenses exceeded revenues by substantial margins. She handed the papers to Mr. Whitcomb, who examined them briefly before passing them to the judge. These records, compiled by independent auditors from New Orleans, show the plantation's financial status before and after the transition to free labor. Charlotte's voice was steady, but Lila could see her hands trembling slightly. The results have exceeded even my most optimistic projections. Judge Morrison studied the documents carefully. Around the courthouse square, townspeople craned their necks to hear every word. The banker who had tried to seize Lila and Caleb 6 months earlier stood near the back of the crowd, his face grim. According to these figures, the judge said slowly, your cotton yields increased by 30% this year. Harvest time was reduced by 2 weeks. And overall expenses decreased despite the addition of wages for workers. That's correct, Your Honor. How do you account for these improvements? Charlotte glanced at Lila, who stepped forward slightly. Workers who benefit from their labor have incentive to excel. When people know their efforts will be rewarded, they take pride in quality rather than simply fulfilling minimum requirements. And the school? The judge asked. I understand you've established an educational facility on plantation grounds. Miss Lila teaches reading, writing, arithmetic, and practical skills to children from across the county, Charlotte said proudly. We now have students whose parents travel 20 miles each way to attend her classes. At what cost? The school generates revenue through tuition payments and contracts with neighboring plantations whose owners want educated workers. Last month alone, we earned $300 teaching advanced mathematics to prospective overseers and bookkeepers. A murmur ran through the crowd. $300 was more than most families earned in a year. Lila opened a small notebook and read aloud. This term we have 38 students enrolled in basic literacy, 22 in advanced arithmetic, and 15 in specialized courses including navigation, surveying, and animal husbandry. Our graduates have found employment as clerks, teachers, and skilled craftsmen throughout the parish. Judge Morrison made notes on his papers. Mrs. Bellamy, are you prepared to demonstrate that all outstanding debts can be satisfied through current plantation revenues? Yes, Your Honor. Charlotte removed another document from her portfolio. This is a payment schedule that will satisfy all legitimate creditors within 18 months, using only profits from current operations. The banker pushed forward through the crowd. Your Honor, this is impossible. No plantation can generate such revenues using paid labor. The numbers must be falsified. Are you questioning the competency of the New Orleans auditing firm that prepared these records? The judge asked mildly. I'm questioning the plausibility of the claims. Mr. Whitcomb stood up. Your Honor, I have examined all financial records personally. The documentation is thorough and accurate. Moreover, I have observed the plantation's operations firsthand and can attest to their remarkable efficiency. Furthermore, Dr. Matthews called from the crowd, I can testify that worker health and morale have improved dramatically. Medical expenses have dropped by 60%, and productivity gains are clearly visible to any observer. The judge considered all the evidence carefully. Pike, listening from his guarded position near the jail wagon, looked increasingly desperate. Your Honor, Pike called out, these people are lying. No plantation can operate profitably without slave labor. It's economically impossible. Mr. Pike, Judge Morrison replied coldly, you are facing trial for fraud and embezzlement. Your opinions on economic matters carry little weight in this court. He turned back to Charlotte. Mrs. Bellamy, based on the evidence presented, I find that your plantation is financially sound and capable of satisfying all legitimate debts through normal operations. Your creditors' claims for forced sale are hereby dismissed. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Charlotte felt her knees go weak with relief. Lila grabbed Caleb's hand and squeezed tight. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, this court recognizes the educational and economic benefits that your free labor experiment has brought to the entire county. I hereby grant official status to the Bellamy Academy for Practical Education with full authority to issue certificates and diplomas recognized throughout Louisiana. More cheers from the crowd. Mrs. Ward wiped tears from her eyes. Reverend Williams removed his hat in a gesture of respect. The judge stood and gathered his papers. Missus Bellamy, Miss Lila, you have demonstrated that moral courage and practical wisdom can transform not only individual lives, but entire communities. This court commends your example and wishes you continued success. As the crowd began to disperse, people came forward to congratulate Charlotte and Lila. Former critics acknowledged that they had been wrong about the viability of free labor. Parents inquired about enrolling their children in the academy. Even the banker approached to discuss potential business relationships. But the moment Lila would remember most came when an elderly man approached carrying a small girl who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Miss Lila, he said shyly, this here's my granddaughter Lucy. Her mama died when she was born, and I've been trying to teach her letters myself, but I ain't much good at it. The little girl looked at Lila with wide, curious eyes. Could she maybe come to your school? I got a little money saved, and I could work extra to pay tuition. Lila knelt down so she was at eye level with the child. What's your favorite song, Lucy? Jesus loves the little children, the girl whispered. Lila began to hum the tune, then added simple arithmetic. 1 + 1 is 2, 2 + 2 is 4, 4 + 4 is 8, and 8 + 8 is… She paused expectantly. 16, Lucy said with delight. Very good. I think you'll do wonderfully at our school. As they walked home through the town square, past the courthouse where their freedom had been won and their future secured, Lila felt the weight of possibility settling around her like a warm shawl. The blue ribbon at her throat caught the afternoon sunlight, and for a moment she remembered the 13-year-old girl who had hummed in the plantation kitchen to quiet barking dogs. That girl had dreamed of freedom but could never have imagined this standing in a public square as a recognized educator, planning curricula for students who traveled from across the county to learn. What are you thinking about? Charlotte asked as they reached the edge of town. Tomorrow's lessons and next year's plans. And, Lila paused, searching for words, all the songs we haven't sung yet. Charlotte smiled. That's a beautiful way to think about the future. Behind them, the courthouse bell began to toll, not marking an hour this time, but celebrating the conclusion of official business. The bronze note echoed across the square and out over the river, carrying news of justice served and promises kept. At the plantation, workers were returning from the fields with the day's final cotton harvest. Children ran from the schoolhouse toward homes, where supper waited, and parents who could now read the lessons their children brought home. In the kitchen, Dinah hummed as she prepared the evening meal for a household that had learned to live by choice rather than compulsion. Lila climbed the front porch steps and paused at the door. 6 months ago, she had entered this house as property. Tonight, she would sit at the dinner table as family, not blood family, but something perhaps even more precious. Family chosen freely by people who had decided to build a life together based on respect and mutual benefit. The screen door opened, and Caleb appeared with a reading book tucked under his arm. Lila, come see. I can read the whole story now, all by myself. She followed him inside, where oil lamps cast warm circles of light and the smell of cornbread filled the air. Charlotte was already at the table, spreading out plans for expanding the academy. Moses sat nearby, helping young Thomas with his mathematics homework. Outside, the November evening settled over fields, where free workers went home to beds they had chosen, carrying wages they had earned, planning futures they could determine for themselves. The ribbon at Lila's throat lifted slightly in the evening breeze that drifted through the open windows. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, one final note clear and bright as a promise kept, soft as a prayer answered, certain as a new day dawning. In the kitchen, someone began to hum a hymn about freedom and redemption, and one by one, other voices joined in harmony, voices that had learned, Finally, that the greatest songs are those sung by choice rather than command.